He dumped me for being too poor to fit his world, until he realized I'm the CEO he's been trying to meet for years. The public humiliation. Scene: an expensive bridal shop. Mensah is holding a veil, looking at Brian. Mensah, these are all so beautiful, Brian. I can't believe our wedding is only a month away. Which one do you like? Brian, he doesn't look up from his phone. I don't know, Mensah. They all look cheap. Just like that waitress uniform you wear every day. Mensah, hurt, Brian, what's wrong? You've been so cold lately. Socialite, CHLOE, walking out of the dressing room in a $20,000 gown. He's cold because he's finally realized he belongs in a different world, Mensah. A world you can't afford to even look at. Mensah, Chloe. What are you doing at my dress fitting? Brian, standing up, it's not your fitting anymore, Mensah. There's something I've been needing to tell you. Mensah, just say it, Brian. CHLOE, smirking, I'm pregnant, Mensah. And Brian is the father. We're getting married in 2 weeks. Mensah, quietly, that isn't funny. Brian, it's not a joke. I'm moving on. I need a woman who can help my career, not someone who smells like old coffee and dish soap. I'm assuming you won't be needing an invitation. The introduction, the emotional explosion and the pivot. Mensah, 5 years, Brian. 5 years down the drain. I worked double shifts at the club to pay your rent. I paid for your business degree. I took care of your mother when she was sick. Are you kidding me right now? Brian, oh my God, stop being so dramatic. You were an investment that didn't pay off. CHLOE, look, I already had the movers throw your poor person clothes into the dumpster behind the club. That's where you belong, right? With the trash. Mensah, voice shaking with rage, have fun with your stolen life, you too. You think you've won. You have no idea what you just lost. Scene change, Mensah is walking in the rain toward the executive club. She wipes her eyes and pulls out a sleek, black phone. Mensah, into phone, this is CEO Park. Move the Arashiro meeting to Monday. I'm taking the night off to handle some personal trash. And tell the board if Brian's startup asks for a loan again, reject it instantly. Scene change, inside the dim, luxury club. Mensah is back in her waitress uniform, cleaning a table. John Arashiro enters. He looks tired and powerful. John, to himself, where is this CEO Park? I've been chasing a ghost for 6 months. Mensah, approaching him, excuse me, sir. Would you like some tea while you wait? You look like you've had a very long day. John, looking up, surprised by her kindness, tea would be perfect. Thank you. Mensah. Mensah, smiles sadly, just a waitress, sir. John, studying her, I don't think so. I've met a lot of powerful people today, but you're the first one who actually seems real. Inside John's head, why does this waitress have the same sharp eyes as the CEO I'm supposed to meet? And why do I feel like I need to protect her? John, actually, forget the tea. Can I walk you home after your shift? You look like someone who has been through a war today. Mensah, horrified, you don't want to do that, Mr. Arashiro. I'm just a poor girl from the dump, remember? John, taking her hand, then let's go show them that the dump just lost its most valuable diamond. The executive club was filled with the sound of clinking crystal and the low hum of deals being made. Mensah moved through the shadows, her tray balanced perfectly on her hand. She wore her simple black uniform like a shield. After the explosion at the bridal shop, she just wanted to disappear into her work. She wanted to forget the way Brian had looked at her, as if she were a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his expensive shoe. But the world was not done being cruel. At a corner table, bathed in warm golden light, sat Brian and Chloe. They were surrounded by shopping bags from the most expensive stores in the city. Brian was laughing, his arm draped over the back of Chloe's chair. He looked every bit like the successful businessman Mensah had helped him become. "Excuse me, waitress," Chloe called out, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "This table is filthy. Come here and clean it." Mensah froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't turn away. She walked toward them, her head held high. As she reached the table, she saw the smug smile on Brian's face. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look sorry. "Mensah," Brian said, leaning back. "I told you that you belonged at the dump, but I guess I was wrong. You belong right here, serving people like us. It suits you." Mensah took a damp cloth and began to wipe a spill near Chloe's hand. "I am doing my job, Brian. A job that paid your bills for 5 years." Chloe laughed, a high, sharp sound. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. Brian told me all about your little investment. Consider it a fee for getting to stand in the same room as him for so long." She intentionally tipped her water glass, watching the liquid soak into the table and drip onto Mensah's shoes. "Oops. Clean that up, too." Mensah stopped. She looked Brian directly in the eyes. "Is this who you are now? Someone who kicks people when they are down?" Brian's expression turned cold. He stood up, leaning over the table until he was inches from her face. The smell of his expensive cologne made her sick. "Some people are born to serve, Mensah, and some are born to lead," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I am a leader now. You are just the girl who brings the drinks. Know your place and get back to work." He tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the wet table. "Keep the change. You clearly need it more than I do." The guests at the nearby tables began to whisper and point. Mensah felt the heat of humiliation rising in her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that she owned more of this city than Brian could ever dream of. But she forced herself to stay silent. She picked up the wet bill with trembling fingers and walked away. As she vanished into the kitchen, she didn't see the dark-haired man sitting at the bar. John Arashiro had seen everything. He watched Brian with a look of pure disgust, then turned his gaze toward the door where Mensah had disappeared. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a diamond that was being stepped on by a boot, and he was already planning how to pick it up. The rain in Tokyo felt like needles against Mensah's skin. She stood on the sidewalk outside the bridal shop, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. Only an hour ago, she had been dreaming of white lace and a lifetime of happiness. Now, she was staring at the red taillights of Brian's sports car as it sped away, splashing dirty puddle water onto her thin coat. "I can't believe it," she whispered to the empty street. Her voice was swallowed by the thunder. 5 years. She had spent every single day of those 5 years building a life for Brian. When he had no money for his business classes, she worked double shifts. When his mother was in the hospital, Mensah stayed up all night by her bed so Brian could sleep. She had poured her heart, her time, and her secret savings into him, thinking they were a team. But Brian didn't want a team. He wanted a trophy. "You're just not on my level anymore, Mensah," his voice echoed in her head. He had said it so easily, right before Chloe climbed into his car. Chloe, with her perfect silk hair and her father's millions. Brian didn't even look back. He just closed the door on Mensah's life as if she were a piece of trash he was finally done with. Mensah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. It was an old model, cracked and slow, because she had spent her extra money on Brian's new laptop last month. She looked at a photo of them from a year ago. They looked so happy. Or maybe she was the only one who was happy. Maybe he had been planning to leave her the moment he found someone better. The wind picked up, turning her umbrella inside out. She let it go. It didn't matter. She was already soaked to the bone. She felt a deep, cold ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the feeling of being completely replaced. To Brian, she wasn't a person with feelings, she was just a ladder he had used to climb to the top. Now that he was there, he was kicking the ladder away. "He thinks I'm nothing," she said, her teeth chattering. "He thinks I'm just a poor girl with no future." She wiped the rain and tears from her face with a wet sleeve. Brian didn't know that Mensah had a secret. He didn't know about the black phone hidden in her bag, or the emails from global directors waiting for her reply. He thought he had left her with nothing, but he had actually done the one thing she was too afraid to do herself. He had set her free. Mensah turned away from the bright lights of the shopping district and started walking toward the executive club. Her heart was trashed, and her pride was wounded, but her mind was starting to clear. Brian wanted a world of power and status. Fine. She would show him exactly who really owned that world. She wasn't just a waitress in the rain anymore. The poor girl was gone. Tomorrow, the CEO would wake up. Mensah stepped into the small, quiet employee locker room at the back of the executive club. The sound of the rain outside was muffled here. She sat down on a cold wooden bench and took a deep breath. Her shoes were still wet from the street, and her heart still felt like it had been stepped on, but she had a job to do. She reached into the hidden bottom of her bag and pulled out a second phone. This one didn't have a cracked screen. It was thin, heavy, and solid black. When she touched the screen, it lit up with hundreds of notifications. These weren't text messages from friends or social media alerts. They were high-level security reports, bank transfers, and urgent emails from boardrooms across the ocean. To Brian, she was just a waitress who wasn't on his level. To the rest of the world, she was the ghost CEO of Park Industries. Years ago, her father had built the company from nothing. Before he passed away, he had made her promise to keep the family legacy alive. But Mensah didn't want the fame or the greedy people who came with it. She wanted to know what people were really like when they thought no one was watching. So, she hired a team of lawyers to run the daily office work while she stayed in the shadows, living a simple life and working at the club. She swiped through the emails. One was from her lead attorney. "Ma'am, the Arashiro Group is pushing for a meeting again. John Arashiro says he won't leave the city until he speaks with you personally. He wants a merger." Mensah leaned her head against the locker. The irony made her want to laugh. Brian had spent the last year trying to get a meeting with anyone from Park Industries. He had begged for a chance to show them his small startup, hoping for a crumb of their success. He had no idea that the woman who cooked his dinner and washed his clothes was the one who signed the rejection letters he received every month. "You wanted a leader, Brian," she whispered to the empty room. "You just didn't realize you were looking at one." She typed a quick reply to her lawyer, "Tell Mr. Arashiro I am busy. I will decide when I am ready to see him. Also, keep an eye on Brian's company. If they try to partner with our rivals, let me know." She tucked the black phone back into its hiding place. She stood up and smoothed out her waitress apron. In this uniform, she was invisible to people like Brian and Chloe. They looked right through her as if she were a ghost. But that was her greatest power. She could see their true faces, their greed, and their lies. Mensah checked her reflection in the small, scratched mirror on the wall. Her eyes were still red from crying, but there was a new spark in them. The secret crown she wore was heavy, but it was hers. Brian thought he had left her with nothing, but he had actually left her with the most dangerous thing in the world, a woman with nothing left to lose and an empire at her fingertips. She opened the door and walked back out onto the floor, ready to serve tea to the very people she could destroy with a single phone call. The front doors of the executive club swung open, letting in a swirl of cool night air. A man stepped inside, and suddenly, the loud chatter of the room seemed to dip. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't wearing a bright gold watch to show off, but everyone noticed him. He moved with a quiet power that made the other rich men in the room look like they were just pretending. This was John Arashiro. Mensah stood by the bar, her hands resting on the counter. She had heard his name in a dozen meetings this month. He was the man her lawyers said was dangerous in business because he never gave up. He was the billionaire who wanted to buy her company. She watched him walk toward a small table in the corner, far away from the noisy group where Brian and Chloe were still showing off their shopping bags. As John sat down, he didn't snap his fingers or yell for service. He simply waited. When Mensah approached him with a menu, she felt a strange spark of nerves. She had faced powerful people before, but John's eyes were different. They weren't looking through her like she was a ghost. They were looking at her. "Good evening, sir," Mensah said, her voice steady. "Would you like to see the drink list?" John looked up and gave her a small, tired smile. "Actually, a cup of green tea would be wonderful, please. If it isn't too much trouble." Mensah blinked. She had worked at this club for a long time, and she could count on one hand how many people had said please to her tonight. Most of the men here treated her like a machine that delivered coffee. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right out," she replied. "Thank you, Mensah," he said softly, glancing at the small name tag on her uniform. She turned away, her heart beating a little faster. He knew her name. He hadn't just looked at her apron, he had acknowledged her as a person. It was such a small thing, but after the way Brian had treated her like trash, it felt like a warm light in a dark room. When she returned with the tea, she noticed John was looking at a file on his lap. It was a report about Park Industries, her company. He looked frustrated. He rubbed his temples as if he had a headache that wouldn't go away. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked as she set the cup down. John sighed and closed the folder. "I am chasing a ghost, Mensah. I've traveled halfway around the world to meet a CEO who refuses to even answer my calls. I'm starting to think this CEO Park doesn't actually exist." Mensah kept her face perfectly still. She reached out and straightened his napkins. "Maybe they are just waiting to see if you are someone worth talking to," she suggested quietly. John laughed, a real, honest sound. "Maybe you're right. Most people in my world only care about the money. Maybe CEO Park is looking for something else." He took a sip of the tea and nodded. "This is perfect. Thank you again." As Mensah walked back toward the bar, she felt John's eyes follow her for a moment. She knew she should keep her distance. She was the ghost he was hunting, after all. But as she looked at Brian across the room, loud, rude, and greedy, and then back at John, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to be seen. The executive club felt smaller than usual the next evening. Brian had booked a large, circular table right in the center of the room. He was wearing a brand new suit that probably cost more than Mensah made in a month. Beside him, Chloe was busy checking her reflection in a gold compact mirror, looking bored and superior. They were waiting for someone important, and Brian was sweating through his expensive collar. When John Arashiro walked in, Brian jumped to his feet so fast he almost knocked over his chair. "Mr. Arashiro. It is such an honor. Thank you for taking the time to meet with a rising star like myself," Brian said, his voice loud and desperate. John nodded politely, but his eyes stayed cool. He sat down and looked at the menu. Brian started talking immediately, bragging about his startup and how he was going to change the world. He kept using big words to sound smart, but John just listened in silence, occasionally glancing toward the bar. Mensah approached the table with a tray of water. She kept her eyes down, her heart racing. She didn't want a scene, but she had to do her job. As she reached out to set a glass down in front of John, Brian's face twisted with fake embarrassment. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Brian snapped, looking at John as if he were sharing a private joke. "I am so sorry, Mr. Arashiro. Our service tonight is a bit slow. Some people just weren't built for high-class establishments." He turned to Mensah, his voice dripping with venom. "Watch where you're putting that, waitress. If you spill a single drop on this suit, you'll be working for free for the next year. Not that your tiny paycheck matters anyway." Mensah's hand stayed steady, but she felt the sting of his words. She looked at John, expecting him to join in or look away. Instead, John's brow furrowed. He looked at Brian's hand, then at Mensah's face. "Is there a problem?" John asked. His voice was like ice. "No problem, sir," Brian laughed nervously, trying to regain control. "She's just my ex. I had to let her go because she didn't have the ambition to keep up with me. She's fine for bringing drinks, but she doesn't understand the world of big business like we do." He flicked his hand at Mensah as if he were shooing away a fly. Go on now. Get us some real wine. The expensive stuff. And try not to trip over your own feet on the way back. Chloe giggled, leaning into Brian's shoulder. She really is an eyesore, isn't she, Brian? Mensah felt a wave of heat rush to her face. She looked at John one last time. He wasn't laughing. In fact, he looked disgusted. He looked at the way Brian treated her, then at the way Mensah held her head high despite the insults. Actually, John said, his voice cutting through Brian's laughter. I think I've seen enough of your ambition for one night, Brian. Mensah, please don't worry about the wine. Brian froze, his smile disappearing. But sir, we haven't even talked about the merger. John stood up, adjusting his jacket. I don't do business with people who treat others like garbage just because they think they can. It tells me everything I need to know about your character. John walked away without looking back. Mensah stood there, holding her empty tray, watching Brian's face turn a bright, angry red. He had tried to crush her to look big, but he had only succeeded in losing the biggest deal of his life. For the first time in days, Mensah felt like she could breathe again. The silence at the table was heavy and cold. Brian sat frozen, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. He looked at the empty chair where John Arashiro had been sitting just a second ago. Then, he looked at Mensah. His face turned from pale white to a deep, angry purple. He felt small, and he hated it. Look what you did. Brian hissed, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. You ruined it. That was $1 million deal, and you stood there like a ghost until he walked away. You're a curse, Mensah. Everything you touch turns to trash. Chloe stood up too, her eyes narrow and mean. He's right. You did that on purpose, didn't you? You're so jealous that Brian found someone better that you had to destroy his future. Mensah didn't back down. She gripped her tray tightly, her knuckles turning white. I didn't say a word, Brian. You were the one who showed him exactly who you are. You did this to yourself. Brian stepped around the table, raising his finger to point it in her face. Get out of my sight. If I see you in this club again, I'll make sure the manager fires you. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere near people like us. That is quite enough, a voice boomed from the shadows near the entrance. John Arashiro stepped back into the light. He hadn't left the building, he had been waiting by the door, watching the whole scene. He walked back to the table, his steps slow and purposeful. He stood between Brian and Mensah, his presence like a wall of stone. Mr. Arashiro. Brian stuttered, trying to put on a fake smile again. I'm so sorry you had to see that. This girl is just. This girl has more dignity in her pinky finger than you have in your entire body, John interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it sounded like thunder. I told you I was leaving because of your character. Now, I am telling you to leave this club. If you ever speak to her like that again, I will make sure every bank in this city knows your name for the wrong reasons. Brian looked at John, then at the security guards who were now moving toward the table. He realized he had no power here. He grabbed his coat, and Chloe grabbed her bags. They scurried out of the club like beaten dogs, not looking back. John turned to Mensah. The ice in his eyes melted instantly. Are you all right? He asked gently. I am sorry you had to go through that. Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not by someone they once cared for. Mensah felt a lump in her throat. For the first time in years, someone had stood up for her without wanting anything in return. Thank you, Mr. Arashiro, she whispered. You didn't have to do that. John smiled, a real, warm smile. I think I did. And please, call me John. I have a feeling we are going to be seeing much more of each other. He walked away, leaving Mensah standing in the quiet club. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of her black CEO phone. She felt a strange mix of guilt and hope. John was looking for a business partner, but he had found a friend instead. He had no idea that the waitress he just protected was the very woman who held his company's future in her hands. For the first time, Mensah wondered if it was time to stop being a ghost. The following morning, the sun struggled to shine through the gray clouds over the city. Mensah sat in her small apartment, holding a thick, gold-edged envelope that had been slipped under her door. It was heavy and smelled like expensive perfume. When she opened it, a card fell out. It was a formal invitation to the Park Industries annual gala, the biggest event of the year for the business world. At the bottom of the card, in elegant black ink, were the words, "All board members and executive staff must attend. Guest of honor, the anonymous CEO." Mensah stared at the words until they became a blur. For years, she had been a ghost. She had signed papers from this very kitchen table while wearing her waitress uniform. She had let the world believe she didn't exist so she could have a quiet life. But after the way Brian had humiliated her, and after the way John had stood up for her, something inside her had shifted. The quiet life felt like a cage now. She looked at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror on the wall. She saw the tired eyes of a waitress, but she also saw the sharp, clever mind of the woman who had built an empire. "Know your place," Brian's voice echoed in her head. She gripped the invitation until the gold edges dug into her skin. Brian would be at that gala. He would be there with Chloe, trying to find a new rich person to trick into helping his failing business. He would be looking for CEO Park, hoping for a miracle, never dreaming that the miracle was the woman he had called trash. "I will show you my place, Brian," Mensah whispered. Her voice was no longer shaky. It was as cold and hard as a diamond. She picked up her black CEO phone and called her lead attorney. The man answered on the first ring, his voice full of surprise. "Ma'am. Is everything all right?" "I'm going to the gala," Mensah said. "And I'm not going as a guest. I want the full security team. I want the best dress in the city. And I want John Arashiro to be informed that the CEO he has been looking for will finally meet him tonight." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, ma'am? Once you step onto that stage, there is no going back. Everyone will know your face." Mensah looked at the waitress apron hanging on the back of her chair. She thought about the spills she had cleaned up and the insults she had swallowed. She thought about John's kind eyes and Brian's cruel laugh. "I'm sure," Mensah replied. "It's time to stop hiding. I'm tired of being a ghost. I want to be a queen." She hung up the phone and stood tall. The poor girl was officially gone. Tonight, the world would meet the real Mensah Park, and she was going to make sure they never forgot her name. The grand ballroom of the Park Plaza was a sea of sparkling lights, expensive perfumes, and people who moved like they owned the world. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the men in tuxedos and women in silk dresses. Near the champagne fountain, Brian stood tall, smoothing his suit jacket and checking his watch every few seconds. Beside him, Chloe was busy whispering to a group of socialites about how they were personal friends of the Arashiro family. "Any minute now, Chloe," Brian whispered, his eyes scanning the crowd. "The CEO of Park Industries is supposed to arrive. If I can just get 30 seconds of her time, our lives will change forever. We'll be billionaires by morning." Suddenly, the massive gold doors at the front of the room swung open. The music slowed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A woman stepped into the light, and it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She was wearing a deep purple gown made of the finest silk, with a high slit that showed off her confidence. Around her neck was a diamond necklace that captured every bit of light in the room. She looked powerful, elegant, and untouchable. Brian's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. He didn't even notice the wine splashing onto his shoes. He rubbed his eyes, leaning forward until he almost fell over. "No," he gasped, his voice cracking. "That's impossible. That's Mensah." Chloe's jaw dropped. "The waitress. Is she insane? Look at that dress. That has to cost $50,000. Brian, she must have stolen it from the club's lost and found." Or maybe she snuck in through the kitchen to try and humiliate us. Brian's shock turned into a cold, sharp anger. He felt humiliated that his poor ex-girlfriend was standing in a room where she didn't belong, looking better than the woman on his arm. He began to march toward her, his face turning red. "Mensah," he shouted, loud enough for the nearby guests to turn and stare. Mensah stopped and turned slowly. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look like the girl who had cried in the rain. She looked at Brian with eyes that were as cold as ice. "Do you have any idea where you are?" Brian hissed, grabbing her arm. "This is a private gala for the elite. You can't just put on a fancy dress and pretend you're one of us. You're a waitress, Mensah. You're a nobody. If security finds out you snuck in here, you'll go to jail for a long time." Chloe hurried over, pointing a finger at Mensah's chest. "Take that dress off before you ruin it with your dirty hands. We know you're broke. We know you live in a dump. Who did you trick to get past the door?" Mensah didn't pull away. She looked down at Brian's hand on her arm, then back up at his face. A small, dangerous smile played on her lips. "I didn't have to trick anyone to get into my own house, Brian," she said quietly. Before Brian could scream at her again, a deep voice came from behind them. "Is there a problem here?" John Arashiro stepped forward, his eyes locked on Brian's hand. The look on his face made Brian let go of Mensah's arm instantly. Brian opened his mouth to explain that the waitress had snuck in, but the words died in his throat as John stepped beside Mensah and bowed his head with deep respect. John Arashiro stood beside Mensah, his presence like a shield against Brian's anger. Brian was still shaking with rage, his face twisted as he looked at Mensah's expensive purple dress. He was sure she had stolen it. He was sure she was a liar. He opened his mouth to tell John that this waitress was a criminal who had snuck into the party, but before he could speak, the lights in the ballroom began to dim. A bright spotlight hit the center of the large wooden stage at the front of the room. A man in a sharp tuxedo stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said, his voice full of excitement. "Tonight is a night many of you have waited years for. For a long time, the leader of Park Industries has stayed in the shadows. Many people thought this person didn't even exist. But tonight, the mystery ends." Brian stopped breathing. He looked at the stage, then back at Mensah. He saw the way she was standing, perfectly still, her chin held high, not a single bit of fear in her eyes. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Please welcome the woman who built this empire," the host shouted. "Our guest of honor, and the owner of Park Industries. Mississippi Mensah Park." The entire ballroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Hundreds of the richest people in the world turned their heads at the same time. They watched as Mensah stepped away from Brian and Chloe. She didn't look back at them. She didn't have to. She walked toward the stage, the silk of her gown rustling softly against the floor. Every eye was on her. Brian felt like the world was spinning. He looked at Chloe, who was pale and trembling, her mouth hanging open. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had tossed a $20 bill at Mensah just a few nights ago. He remembered calling her trash. He remembered telling her to know her place. Mensah reached the stairs of the stage. John Arashiro reached out his hand, helping her up the final step with a smile that showed he was proud to be near her. Mensah stood behind the microphone and looked out at the crowd. When her eyes passed over Brian, she didn't look angry. She looked at him as if he were a bug she had stepped on a long time ago and forgotten about. "Good evening," Mensah said. Her voice was calm, clear, and powerful. It filled every corner of the room. "For a long time, I watched this world from the outside. I watched how people treat those they think are beneath them. I learned that true power isn't about the money in your bank account. It's about the truth in your heart." Brian felt like he was shrinking. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He realized that the woman he had dumped for being too poor was the only person who could save his failing company. And he had just insulted her in front of the most powerful men in Japan. the revelation hit him like a physical blow. Mensah Park wasn't just a waitress. She was the queen of the city, and he had just lost everything. The silence in the room felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Brian's shoulders. As Mensah stood on the stage, the bright lights reflecting off her diamond necklace, Brian felt the world tilting under his feet. His startup was failing. He owed money to everyone in the city. He had spent the last month telling investors that he was close to a deal with Park Industries. He had told them he was a big player who knew how to handle elite leaders. Now, he realized he had been trying to trick the very woman whose heart he had broken. "Mensah," he whispered, his voice trembling. He pushed past a group of shocked businessmen, tripping over his own feet. He didn't care about Chloe anymore. He didn't care about the gala. He only cared about the fact that the woman he called too poor was now the only person who could stop him from going bankrupt. He reached the edge of the stage just as Mensah was stepping down. Her eyes were calm, but they held a strength that made Brian feel smaller than he ever had before. "Mensah. Wait." Brian shouted, his face pale and sweaty. I didn't know. I swear, I had no idea it was you. If I had known you were the CEO, I never would have said those things. I was just stressed about work. You know how I get." Mensah stopped. She looked at him, and for a moment, Brian thought he saw a flicker of the girl who used to pay his rent. He reached out, trying to grab her hand. "Please, Mensah. My company is in trouble. If you don't sign the merger, I'll lose everything. I'm sorry. I'll leave Chloe. We can go back to how things were. I'll do anything." But before his fingers could touch her silk sleeve, a tall, dark figure stepped in front of him. John Arashiro moved with the speed of a predator. He placed a firm hand on Brian's chest, pushing him back with a force that made Brian stumble. "Stay back," John said. His voice was low, but it carried a threat that made the hair on Brian's neck stand up. "Mr. Arashiro, you don't understand." Brian pleaded, his eyes darting between John and Mensah. "She's my fiancée. We have a history. I just need to talk to her for 1 minute." John didn't move. He stood like a wall of iron between the beggar and the queen. "You lost the right to speak to her the moment you called her trash in my club. You didn't care about her history when she was wearing a waitress uniform. Why should she care about yours now that she's wearing a crown?" Brian looked past John at Mensah. He hoped to see pity, but all he saw was a woman who had finally realized her own worth. "Brian," Mensah said, her voice soft but final. "You told me to know my place. I finally do. And looking at you right now, I realize that your place was never by my side." She turned away, tucking her arm into John's. As they walked toward the exit, the crowd parted for them like the sea. Brian was left standing alone at the foot of the stage, a broken man holding a crumpled invitation to a world he would never be part of again. He was no longer the rising star. He was just a beggar in an expensive suit. The morning after the gala, the city looked different to Mensah. The air was crisp, and the sun sparkled off the glass towers of the business district. She sat in her high-back leather chair on the top floor of Park Industries. For the first time, she wasn't hiding in the shadows or wearing a waitress apron. She wore a sharp, tailored suit that felt like armor, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. A soft knock came at her door. John Arashiro walked in, carrying 2 cups of tea. He didn't look like a billionaire looking for a profit. He looked like the men who had walked a poor girl home in the rain when nobody else cared. He set a cup down on her mahogany desk and sat across from her. "I brought the green tea," John said with a warm smile. "No trouble at all this time." Mensah laughed, the sound echoing through the large office. "Thank you, John. I think I've had enough drama to last a lifetime. It's nice to just sit and breathe." John pulled a thick blue folder from his briefcase and laid it on the desk between them. It was the final merger agreement. This document would join Park Industries and the Arashiro Group into the most powerful company in the world. Brian had spent his whole life dreaming of a paper like this, But he had lost it because he couldn't see the value of the person standing right in front of him. "Before we sign this," John said, his voice turning serious but kind, "I want you to know something. I didn't choose to work with Park Industries because of the money or the technology. I chose to work with you because I saw how you handled yourself when you had nothing. You have a strength that most leaders only pretend to have." Mensah looked at the golden pen in her hand. She thought about the 5 years she had wasted on Brian, and how she used to believe her only value was how much she could help him. She realized now that she was the prize, not the helper. "And I'm signing this because you saw me," Mensah replied, looking him in the eyes. "You saw the waitress. You saw the girl in the rain. You respected me before you knew I had a cent to my name. That's the kind of partner I want." Together, they leaned forward and signed their names at the bottom of the page. It wasn't just a business deal. It was the start of a new empire built on respect and truth. Mensah stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the tiny cars and people below. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. "What happens now?" John asked, standing beside her. Mensah watched the horizon, feeling the power of her new life. "Now, we build something better. A world where it doesn't matter what uniform you wear, but what kind of person you are inside." She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading. The poor girl was gone, and in her place stood a woman who knew her worth. Mensah Park had found her empire, and she was finally home.